For the class on August 5th, we're going to talk briefly about Albino Barrera's article, What Does Catholic Social Thought Recommend for the Economy? I want to point out just a couple things in the article. We're going to talk about the 4 different sectors so that you can begin your sector research for this section of the stakeholder analysis paper. I wanted to point out one thing in the Barrera article. This is on page 29. You'll notice a table of very specific recommendations, and these are all based on principles from Catholic social teaching. The point of this is not to ask you to become an expert in Catholic social teaching, but only to demonstrate how a religious worldview can shape very specific recommendations when it comes to the economy. I'm going to talk about the 4 sectors and identify some of the responsibilities and constraints of each of the sectors. But this image comes from the Barrera article. You'll notice that the one of the key principles in Catholic social teaching is that all humans have dignity, and integral human development is a fundamental expression of that dignity. And integral human development is served by gifts of the self, gifts of each other, and gifts of the earth. You can think of these as categories of thinking about different dimensions of human flourishing. So this is things that we have to develop as individuals, things that we develop in relationship, and things that we develop by virtue of our relationship with the earth. As Barrera argues, there are really 3 major questions that an economy must answer or must address. What will be produced, who will produce it, and how will it be distributed? We're looking at the intersection between market, as we talked about earlier, and organization, as we talked about earlier. But think of this realm here, the society realm, as a network of these market organization spheres. And the organization could be any one of the different sectors. So really this society sphere is made up of hundreds or thousands of these exchanges between organizations and markets. So from the organizational perspective, we talked about how demand or market need is met by something that an organization provides. And on both sides of the exchange relationship equation, it's driven by vision and values. And all of that is embedded within a social, cultural, religious framework. All of that is embedded within a finite environment. We're going to focus on the supply side. Think of the 4 different sectors as suppliers of the things that we need. So you'll notice on the left I've identified the 4 different sectors. The household sectors. Household can also be you can also use the language of family or a community of care without defining exactly what that is. We just want to talk about that loosely as one of the economic sectors. The next is government, and this is, we can think of this in terms of scale, so that could be local, state, or federal. And then we have the for-profit sector. This is also called business or corporations. These are not all structured in the same way. There are publicly traded companies, there are privately held companies, and we're not going to get into those distinctions, but I just want to point them out. And then lastly, there's the non-profit or non-governmental organization or charities. The household structure loosely tends to be structured around a care provider and dependents. Now, a care provider could be or you could think of this in terms of income. People who are bringing in income outside of the home to take care of dependents. Dependents could be children or elderly or anyone who is unable to go out into the workplace and earn a salary. The government sector in the United States is structured as a federal republic, which means that there are three branches of government, as you may remember from your 8th grade civics class. There's the executive branch, which is responsible for enforcing the law. There's the legislative branch, which is made up, well, Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they are responsible for making law. And the judicial branch, which is responsible for interpreting the law. All three of these branches of government are explicitly described in the Constitution of the United States. So this was a common agreement of the people in the United States. So when we start thinking about how society is structured, it's really important to think about how the state is structured. In the for-profit community, these can either be publicly traded, in which case shareholders are the owners of the company, and the primary goal of business is not to make money, contrary to what many people think, but it is to provide goods and service to meet market demand. So you don't make money just because you want to make money. You make money because you provide something that the market wants. The nonprofit sector is something that has only developed in the last couple centuries, so it's not nearly as old as government, for example. We describe the nonprofit or non-governmental organization by its tax status. So you may often hear 501c3, and that means basically that they do not pay the same rate of taxes as for-profits do. So DePaul University, for example, is a non-profit, but DePaul has to make money in order to provide the goods and services that it offers, namely an education. There are different responsibilities here. In Catholic social thought, the household is the basic unit of society. This is where we learn language and values. This is a safety net. So it has a very, very important function, the household sector. So as you think about your challenge question, think about how it intersects with the household sector. The government has a number of different responsibilities. One is to create law, as we talked about earlier. Another one is to structure and regulate the free market, and to regulate what's called the commons. So there are public parks, for example, and this is to protect open space. If you think of Chicago's lakefront, for example, this was an intentional design, and it was not developed, and that was because of the vision of some of the early city planners in Chicago. The government also provides security, it paves roads, and the list goes on and on. But think of the government as one sector that provides some of the goods or services that will address your challenge question. One of the ways that the government sector influences your challenge question is through the creation of laws. Businesses provide goods and services that we consume on a daily basis to survive. So food, clothing, housing, all of these things are often provided by for-profit businesses. So think of the food you had this morning, for example. I doubt any of you grew it, went out to the garden, grew the vegetables, or grabbed the eggs from your chickens. So we buy those goods from a grocery store, and that grocery store is a for-profit entity. It has shareholders, and so this influences how it delivers its goods and services. And the nonprofit sector generally emerges to fill in the gap when the for-profit and government sectors can't provide needs. This is the reason why nonprofits step in. So think of St. Vincent's, the Seton Food Pantry in the St. Vincent de Paul Parish. They are providing meals for people who do not have the income to buy those things in the marketplace. And they also provide food above, beyond, outside of some of the common government programs like food stamps or things of that nature. Now, each of these sectors has a number of constraints. So for family, income is always a constraint. There's only so much salary that comes in. Also, it can psychologically, it can affect how people relate socially, in the sense that it can lead to significant tribalism. So there's in-groups and there's out-groups. This is all an extension of kind of the household thinking. So this is a debate in we find this in the Greek philosophers, a real concern that loyalty to the state should trump loyalty to the family or one's tribe. A constraint of government is that its revenue is limited by taxation. So there's no shortage of things that people want, but there is a shortage of things that people are willing to pay for, and that's usually expressed through taxation. Another constraint is that representatives in the executive, legislative, and judicial branch are usually elected, and they are elected if they appeal to popular opinion. So if you envision some radical change in the law, you have to be aware of how this is shaped by public opinion. Another constraint is that we have a two-party system, which is a way for candidates to get into the public sphere, and that means there are certain commitments in terms of policy. And we know this all too well in the current political discourse, but that's a real constraint of how the government can deliver goods and services that society needs. In the for-profit world, profitability is always a limitation. So corporations will stop doing things if they are not profitable, because a company that isn't profitable goes out of business. It ceases to exist. Another constraint is that businesses use natural resources at an exhausting rate. So, for example, the oil industry and many others are extracting resources from the Earth's crust that are non-renewable. So there's only a finite amount of oil in the oil table. And that's just one example of a natural constraint on the way that for-profits can deliver goods and services. There's also governance structure and laws, local, state, and federal laws that influence and shape the way for-profits can do their business. One of the great constraints in the nonprofit world is its 501c3 status. It means that it cannot be politically active. Otherwise, that gets revoked. So DePaul University cannot legally endorse a candidate for president, for example. We have to be politically neutral. And one of the major constraints, though, for many nonprofits is that they rely on donations, or what's often called philanthropy capital. And people who donate want some sense that their donation is going to meet an immediate need. So over the last few decades, donors have become increasingly concerned with how efficient nonprofits are. Now, there's a flip side to this that we don't have time to go into now. But just keep in mind as you research that these are all constraints for each of the sectors. The goal for this is for you to map out how the four sectors are responding to or attempting to respond to your challenge question, and to identify how they're structured, identify what responsibilities they have, and what constraints they have. There's always going to be a limit. And collectively, these four sectors serve, in Catholic social teaching, what's called the common good. So hopefully this gives you a good overview of the four sectors. And in your stakeholder analysis paper, I'd like to see your analysis of how these four sectors are engaging your challenge question.